the closest I've come to speaking at events like this, on subjects like this, was once at the United Nations, and this is a special reason why I'm grateful to be speaking on an occasion like this, speaking as a Jew who's critical of Israel. So that is as close as I've come, but I'm not going to talk about that, at least directly today. Much to say if you want to ask me. So, someone you probably have not heard of, Will Rogers, who was an American and a Native American, a humorist and a political commentator who thrived in the 1920s and 1930s. He had a definition of diplomacy. Do people know his definition of diplomacy? I hope not, because otherwise this is going to sound very lame. He defined diplomacy as the art of saying, "Nice doggy," until you can find a rock. It's a joke, right? Like other jokes, it has made me, however, stop and think, in this case, about diplomacy and about the world of nations where diplomacy operates. Literature professors like me, who do not represent governments or nations, have a luxury of talking in terms of high and disinterested principles, secure in the knowledge that no one will be offended because no one except a few other literature professors are listening. We may not assume anymore that the aesthetic domain, our object of knowledge, is a domain of disinterestedness, as the philosopher Immanuel Kant told us some time back that it is. But I think we do tend to assume that relations between governments, however politely they're expressed, are everything that literature and culture are not. That is, they are relations of national self-interest. When I have quoted the formula about saying "nice doggy" until you can find a rock, and if you remember nothing else from this talk, you will remember that, I think. What I never considered until now is that it presents diplomacy not just as legitimate self-defense, but as self-defense against a non-human aggressor. And it makes a big difference that it presents diplomacy as self-defense against a non-human aggressor. When the threat comes from a dog, self-defense doesn't need any justification. Think how the scenario would have to change if the threat came from another human. If the threat came not from a dog, but from another human, you would be obliged to ask whether that human was also perhaps perceiving a threat in you and thinking about telling you "nice doggy" until the other human could find a rock. This case is arguably the more representative one. But it's a case that the joke allows you to forget. So I'm doing literary criticism here. I'm criticizing a joke, which surely is a very lame thing to do, but it's what we do. In allowing us to assume that possible attackers are dogs rather than fellow humans, the joke not only presents diplomacy as a cover for legitimate self-defense, but it allows self-defense to serve as a cover for an unquestioned, as we say, naturalized, and often belligerent understanding of national self-interest, as indeed the concept of self-defense has historically served. The United States military, which has not had to defend America's borders from foreign invasion since the War of 1812, has engaged, as you know, in countless wars, extending the nation's political and economic interests on the soil of other countries. It doesn't call itself the War Department, it calls itself the Department of Defense. If I understand my pursuit of my national self-interest as self-defense against dogs, I will not feel any obligation to question or scrutinize or criticize myself or my nation. I will be absolutely sure that I am in the right. If you laugh, and you didn't do a very good job of laughing, I'm sorry to say, but if you do laugh at the joke, I think the pleasure that is released in that laughter is partly the pleasure of thinking, I am absolutely right to do this. I don't have to ask any questions. You can be absolutely sure that what is happening, that your nation is in the right, or what amounts to the same thing, that what is happening in a domain beyond good and evil, where questions about who is right are irrelevant and don't need to be asked. Literature professors like me tend to assume, on the contrary, that self-scrutiny is a universal obligation at the level of the nation, no less than at the level of the self. So if you're an American professor of literature, what you tend to want to talk about is American slavery or America's genocidal treatment of the Native Americans, including Will Rogers, his ancestors. Our professional commitment via literature, via the university, is to self-scrutiny, self-critique, disinterestedness. When we pay attention to the world of nations, our professional disinterestedness tends to take the form of cosmopolitanism, which I have written a couple of books about. Recently, they would have been at the end of that list that didn't get quoted. So a few words about cosmopolitanism as a guide to cultural criticism. I'm presently engaged in a project in which I'm trying to map out moments in literary history, world literary history, in which it became possible for a work of literature to say, my country has committed atrocities against the people of another country. It will not surprise you to hear that this is a relatively rare occurrence. Although pillaging, plundering, slaughtering, and so on have a large place in human history, perhaps even a dominant place, the dominant tradition of the novel, which I write about, did not favor ethical detachment from one's own nation, and has been relatively uninterested in representing any atrocities, let alone atrocities committed against other people. It was therefore a pleasant surprise, and one nice thing about this project is that it has some pleasant surprises in it, for me to learn that as early as 1938, there was at least one published work of Japanese fiction that described the murder of Chinese civilians as the Japanese army was marching toward what was going to be called the rape of Nanjing. The guy got arrested and tried and sentenced and imprisoned, and then they let him go, saying, we will let you go as long as you promise never to write anything like this again, which he did. I mean, he didn't write anything like that again. Another example that I found, if anyone knows this, please tell me. A novella by Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy? You've heard of him? Well, you're not going to like this, though. Wait. It's called Haji Murat. You know Haji Murat? I would like to think this is taught in Russia. I don't know. It describes the destruction of an indigenous village in the Caucasus and what would now be called Chechnya during the 19th century. The 19th century Russian conquests of the East that Tolstoy himself participated in as a young man, and that so neatly mirror the genocide of the Native Americans that my countrymen were carrying out in the same years in the American West. In Tolstoy, we look at the violence through the eyes of a Russian soldier. The Russian's mind is elsewhere, preoccupied with a theme that could not be more conventional for people like him: money he has lost playing cards. For him, this is an unremarkable day, so the reader sees nothing remarkable in it. I quote, "War presented itself to him only in the sense that he subjected himself to danger, the possibility of death, and in so doing earned both decorations and the respect of his comrades here and his friends in Russia. The mountaineers, that is the Chechens, presented themselves to him only as skilled horsemen against whom one had to defend oneself. Given this failure of imagination or sympathy on the Russian side, the narrator, Tolstoy, has to step in and somewhat intrusively make a connection on the next page that no one inside the novel's world is there to make. I quote again, "The village sacked in the raid was the very one in which Haji Murat had spent the night before he went over to the Russians. On returning to his village, Sado," this is someone whose house we've seen Haji Murat visit, "found his hut ruined. The roof had fallen in, the door and pillars of the gallery had been burned, and the interior had been defiled. His son, the handsome boy with the shining eyes, who had looked at Haji Murat in rapture, was carried dead to the mosque on a horse covered with a felt cloak. He had been bayoneted in the back." The sentence about the child who has been bayoneted in the back does not end the paragraph. It's as if a child bayoneted in the back was not ethically or emotionally forceful enough from a Russian point of view in that period to interrupt the flow of narration at all, to justify even the briefest of pauses. These people were considered bandits, you might say like dogs, but dogs who were not worth even saying nice doggie to, let alone spoken about. As with dogs, their deaths did not matter. Tolstoy could not get this book published in his country in his lifetime. It is noteworthy that he left this record at all. And this is one of the greatest writers in world history. So is there any wisdom in this archive of cosmopolitanism for the practice of cultural diplomacy? Can we imagine retelling stories like this as a form of cultural diplomacy? The traditional definition of cosmopolitanism presents it as a commitment to the good of humanity as a whole that overrides all smaller loyalties and commitments. Cosmopolitanism says, you should not place the welfare of those who happen to be located close to you higher than the welfare of those who happen to be far away from you. You should not accept the values of your culture or nation simply because those values happen to be yours. You should not oppose the values of someone else's culture or nation simply because that culture does not happen to be yours. This account, which is often associated today with the project of human rights, is singular and normative. There's only one set of human rights, and they hold in the same way for everyone. The same standard applies everywhere. Cosmopolitanism is a moral ideal. That is its strength, and that is its weakness. It's a moral ideal. Those who believe in it have always had a lot of trouble imagining that it was somehow anchored in human reality, in real people, real collectivities. Hence, there has been a bit of a shift. This is in my world that I'm reporting on. Over the last 20 years or so, this singular or normative conception of cosmopolitanism has been gradually, if only partially, displaced by a different conception of cosmopolitanism as plural, empirical, and descriptive. This is a conception that tries to acknowledge the inevitability of self-interest. In so doing, it tries to make cosmopolitanism less of an abstract moral ideal and more of a force in the world. According to this new understanding, cosmopolitanism can be defined as any one of many possible modes of life, thought, and sensibility that actually exist in the world, that happen when communities travel, as you have, and have experience of more than one place. Cosmopolitanism exists whenever and wherever national commitments and loyalties are seen to be multiple and overlapping, no one of them necessarily trumping the others. For example, when you have a diaspora which feels the power of its society of origin at the same time as it feels the power of its society of destination, where it lives and where it comes from, at the same time. Because there is a tension, there is a dialogue of values. This shift from a normative to a descriptive register has meant that there are now more kinds of cosmopolitanism available to be observed and explored in the present and in the past, and there's more of it. It has meant a disciplinary shift. Social scientists, literary and cultural critics like me, and historians have staked claims to a concept that had seemed to belong largely to philosophers. And it has meant that instead of being the prerogative of privileged European travelers and intellectuals only, cosmopolitanism now has come to be seen as characteristic of many substantial social collectivities, many of them poor or socially disadvantaged, including immigrants who've left their country for economic motives, and also including people who are not all innocent victims, perhaps not innocent at all, even people that we who champion human rights and the rule of law are not in the habit of addressing. It seems to me that cultural diplomacy can only be a meaningful project. It's a bit arrogant of me to say this in this presence, but if we assume exactly the opposite of what the Will Rogers joke assumes, namely that our addressees, the people we address, are not dogs, but people like ourselves. Unfortunately, this is not the prevailing assumption. Today, the prevailing assumption remains that many of the key players on the international scene are exactly like dogs, but dogs to whom it is not even possible to say nice doggie. Today, the paradigm for the dog to whom one does not say nice doggie is the terrorist. As we have all heard, at least in this country, we do not negotiate with terrorists. There is no diplomacy with terrorists. Terrorism sets a limit outside of which there can be no diplomacy. With people like that, you just try to kill them. The Canadian Zanzibari historian Faisal Devji, in a book called The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, begins with a moment in 2004 when Osama bin Laden and his lieutenant Ayman al-Zawahiri offered a truce to any and all countries anywhere in the world that would stop attacking Muslims. As one might have expected, this offer was not officially recognized as such. The refusal to negotiate with terrorists is the limit of diplomacy. For Devji, however, it is nevertheless extremely interesting. He writes, bereft of institutional features like negotiation, arbitration, and contractual guarantees, it was a truce that had lost one kind of political meaning without having gained another, since trust was the only thing either side had to offer. It was as if such everyday terms had come to serve as the bridge to a new and yet unknown politics that took for its arena the globe in its entirety. Notwithstanding its dismissal by Western governments, the groundless trust upon which this truce was based achieved an ambiguous political reality in the public debate that followed al-Qaeda's offer. With Spain's withdrawal of troops from Iraq after the Madrid bombings that same year, widely being seen as an acceptance of bin Laden's terms. What kind of truce was this in which neither institutions nor discussions were involved? What Devji is saying, it seems to me, is that diplomacy of some sort was happening in this case, if only tacitly. The fact that al-Qaeda had murdered many civilians in cold blood was not allowed to block all exchange. At least tacitly, al-Qaeda's own argument was acknowledged. You too have been murdering our civilians, and that looks more legitimate to you only because it's your uniformed military forces that are delegated to perform the violence. But is our terrorism really different in kind from your terrorism? I don't say I totally accept this argument, but I share with Devji a sense that something of value has happened when arguments like these are exchanged, however tacitly. Something of value happens whenever you realize, even while reaching for a rock, that you do not find yourself in the face of a dog, but in the face of another human being. Something of value happens when you realize that the other human being has no more and no less reason to trust you than you have to trust the other human being, and yet it is possible to arrive at something like trust, however groundless and even miraculous. My hypothesis is that we can call that valuable something by the name of cultural diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments for Professor Robbins, please? And if you could introduce yourself as always.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Chike Nwofia. I am an adjunct professor of history at Melbourne College in California. And, but I'm here basically representing the African Film Consortium, which is a consortium, an alliance of filmmakers and producers across the African continent. I curate the Silicon Valley African Film Festival in California. The points you've made are so well taken because this has been right on point. You talk about reframing a people in order, as you dehumanize them, then there is a reason, to do whatever you so feel. And all through the annals of history, we remember Kipling's interesting work of poetry where he says there's a white man's burden, which became a mantra for saving us, Africans and colored peoples of the world, from ourselves, hence colonialism. My comment and question to you, sir, is this. We see today that even in Hollywood, the way characters are framed and people are cast into certain scenes begin to perpetuate into people's minds and basically by extension demean folks. We see also here in this country and a good part of the world a certain sense of Africa that is so diminished, that Africa is only projected as a continent that is always begging for something, that is on its knees. Kids are dying of AIDS, and that's Africa to a lot of people. A lot of people think Africa is a country, as a matter of fact.
You mean it's not?
Yeah, I ask my college students, and their perception of Africa is this, small place where people are probably swinging from tree to tree, as you see in the movies of Tarzan. And this is the power that you speak to, that when people are framed in a certain way, then what then happens is it makes it easy to go bomb those people because they are less than us. How can we, and I'm hoping, and I appreciate this forum because I've been able to meet a whole range of people here, and I'm hoping that we can have an opportunity to connect with each other because we are the people that are doing the work. And people have come from all over the world, and it would be a shame if when we live here, we don't make connections, because I think we need to connect with each other. We each have projects we are working on that we could connect and begin the practical work of cultural diplomacy. The bigger question then is, in the texts, since you are in academics, the texts of literature that we read, the texts of history that we read, everything, pretty much, and even on the African continent, what the kids read now tells them how less they are of themselves, because the person who has written that comes from a certain lens that is about the dominant culture. How can we get the real textbooks into the real classroom so people can learn about their own stories? African American kids in this country don't even have the real sense of African American history. It tells them it's all about slavery. So what are folks like you, the big folks like you, doing that can help, those that are setting, curricular standards and those kinds of things to change this thing? Let's change the narrative so everyone can really have a voice at the table. And I thank you.
Well, I thank you. You haven't been keeping up on the latest scholarship in literature. No, we've been trying to do exactly what you're calling for. So, for example, I teach a lecture course on the world novel from like the mid-1960s to the present. And I begin with a novel you may not know. Many people have not known it, although it's a masterpiece. But now it's coming to be an acknowledged masterpiece. It's in English. It's written in Arabic by a Sudanese writer. And it's called Season of Migration to the North. And, okay, if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. It is an extraordinarily powerful work in its own right, but it's also brilliantly adapted to our curriculum because it takes Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and it turns it over. And it retells the story as the journey up the Thames to the Heart of Darkness in London of a Sudanese intellectual who is framed by another Sudanese intellectual who is regarding him the same way that Marlowe is regarding. I mean, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. But it is now coming to be, it was when I got this from Edward Said, who was a teacher of mine, it at that point was not very well known. Now it is extremely well known. Those kids are getting good stuff, okay? I assure you. Now there are bigger issues around this, like the appeal of we may not agree entirely about this, the Save Darfur campaign, which suggests that there is something intrinsically African about genocide, and the only thing with everything, all violence is genocidal, and what you need is lots and lots of white American kids to come forward with their help and their money and so on. My colleague Mahmoud Mamdani has been very, very effective in sort of cutting out the foundations of that position, but it's tough when it plays to people's good intentions, right? The intention of changing the world, having an effect, and not realizing that in so doing, they're framing Africans here, they're framing themselves as the rescuers from a place of civilization, and so on and so forth. Changing that common sense is very, very difficult. It's a long-term project.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? By the way, is Professor Hibbard also here? Yes, okay, so we shouldn't go too much longer because our next lecture is here. Let's take maybe one more question if we can. On the side of you, lady, please.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Kate. I'm from Australia. And I'll be talking about my work in Aboriginal communities, so I was very impressed that you used an Indigenous American quote to start. Just to answer your question, I work in New York schools in 4 boroughs, and I'm seeing a lot of context, cultural-based books and content being used that's relevant to the communities, which is also interesting, me going into these different communities, but that's a different conversation. My work in remote Aboriginal communities using theatre as a tool for development, I wrote an honours thesis about the experience of my colonial guilt, which I'll talk about. And I want to talk about examples in literature because there was nothing that I could find in my home country that addressed this remote, all these tensions, which I'm sure you're familiar with. That idea, that colonial idea, who speaks for whom, is something that influences me. How do I speak about this when I'm in this position of being the power position? Not so much, but that's the historic, that's my lineage. So I guess my question to you is there aren't very many examples in literature that speak about, in Australia, that speak about this relationship. And I feel like it comes from fear. How do we be open and honest and receptive? But I'm wondering your take on my identity, how do I speak?
I'm honored to be asked the question. I wish I had a better answer to it, but I will go out on a bit of a limb here and say, as it happens, I know a lot of indigenous people, and in fact a lot of indigenous activists from around the world, because my wife was the founding head of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations, so I heard a lot of these, had a lot of conversation. And my sense of it, if I can generalize, is people are really glad of the solidarity and would tell you, don't worry too much about where your ancestors come from. That the solidarity right now in the present is a lot more important than getting down on your knees and saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry for the things that happened when you weren't alive, right? It's much more important to do something about the injustice which exists right now, right? And where you can actually do something. And of course you are doing something.
On that note, we do actually need to conclude. We're a little bit behind schedule, but let's please express our sincere gratitude for excellent